Well, Greg Bondar, Christian Voice Australia. He is National Director. Christian Voice Australia is a national think tank and advocacy group for families, liberty and faith. Greg, a special welcome back to 2020.
Delighted to be with you, Neil, from my long overdue holiday in France.
Well, yes, welcome back. I'm sure you had a great time, and I hope we get to Notre Dame Cathedral, because clearly you must have been there and took it in as just a real experience. But there's other big pressing issues. Get a thought or two before we move into that. The Voice, of course, an overwhelming no vote on the weekend. You've had your own reflections on why it failed and a Christian perspective on it.
I had a look at The Voice in quite a lot of detail. As you probably know, Neil, I used to work for a large Aboriginal land council. I was chief executive. I had 17 Indigenous staff, and I got very close to the Indigenous community there. Now, in the last couple of weeks, in the lead up to The Voice, I looked at what is happening, and I must tell you, Neil, that there's been a lot of virtue signalling, both by Christians and non-Christians. And then I started to look at what actually went wrong from The Voice's perspective. I don't think anyone should be gloating that it didn't get through. I think a lot of people would like to see Indigenous people recognised in the Constitution, but a lot wouldn't like to see a voice established. So there are two different issues there. Now, from my perspective, and I had a look at this really, that the reason it failed is because, look, you can never really have such a thing as an Indigenous voice. There are a lot of disagreements. There are a lot of unknown facts. And I think if you look at Galatians 3:28, Neil, it came to my mind that there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male or female, for you are all one in Christ. And I think that's the attitude that should have been taken both by governments and some of those Christians that advocated for a yes vote. The other thing is really very quickly, Neil, was The Voice was a recipe for revenge rather than reconciliation, in my view. The Voice really enshrined a divisive racialism, which I was totally opposed to. And more importantly, Neil, The Voice rejected forgiveness and it really distracted from the real solutions that the Indigenous community needs right now, rather than just a voice which is really virtue signalling, in my opinion.
Greg, interesting you note the forgiveness idea. I did hear some commentary over this past couple of days that forgiveness needs to be a next phase of where we move from sorry. And I have spoken to Aboriginal people who've said, yes, of course we have forgiven. But it's a little bit like the national voice for Aboriginal people has not necessarily expressed that forgiveness. And in some sense, you might say, where is that national voice? Because there's lots of sort of more localised voices, but there needs to be forgiveness that comes as a next phase as the reconciliation process moves forward. What are your thoughts here, more specifically about that word forgiveness, and whether that can be something on a national level?
Yeah, I think, Neil, the answer to that is yes, we need to concentrate on forgiveness, but more importantly from both sides, Neil. I think both from the Indigenous side and the side of those that are non-Indigenous, I guess, for the want of a better distinction. See, the issue we've got here, Neil, is that I think a lot of people have the attitude that we need to forgive for past things that we've done. But the Indigenous community also has to forgive the fact that a lot of us weren't involved in any issues that were raised. What we need to be doing is, from a biblical perspective, Neil, is that we have to forgive. And likewise, when I was working with the Aboriginal community, they came up to me and they really had the same approach, and they rang me recently too, that forgiveness is the key solution. And that's the approach I think that it should have been taken from a national perspective.
Let me just take you back to something you said to Greg. You said you can never have an Indigenous voice, which was what the whole referendum was about. My assumption, if you can't have an Indigenous voice or should not have a specific Indigenous voice, is that you do need to have a voice for the disadvantaged. because disadvantaged takes in both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Any thoughts here around the unity of Australia, you know, all of us together, one people, one set of Australians, how disadvantage might necessarily be the focus here on in?
Yeah, Neil, I think you make a really good point. I have to tell you, when I was Chief Executive of Tharawal Local Aboriginal Land Council, I used to belong to a New South Wales group of different land councils, and we'd get together for meetings. Neil, before there's reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, I think that their own Indigenous organisations, not only within New South Wales but nationally, have to come to some agreement. And I have to tell you, there was so much infighting. So in my view, there is no such thing as a unified Indigenous voice. So what needs to be done is, you know, there's got to be a lot of reconciliation between various Indigenous voices. Have a look at Jacinta Price, have a look at Noel Pearson, the different views. So once we get that, once we get them singing from the same hymn book, Neil, I think we're on our road to a more reconciliation and then thereby helping those that are disadvantaged. And I've seen a lot of that happening during my time when I was with the Land Council.
We were talking through the campaign for the referendum about the fact that there are so many Aboriginal organisations that already, in some sense, have a voice. What you're saying is there needs to be some combined voice getting together. And that might be what the aspiration was with an actual voice that could be a singular voice to the Parliament. Now that the Australian people have knocked that on the head, ways that there might be a singular voice. How do you see the possibilities of how those comings together might actually happen?
Yeah. Neil, the issue here is that I said the Indigenous community have to come together, sort their own backyard out first, before we start looking at a national voice. And in that regard, you're not going to have a unified Indigenous voice. It's not going to happen. It can't happen because of various ideologies, various political, socio-economic viewpoints. I'd love to see it happen, Neil, but I don't think it will happen. And I think the issue we've got to address here is, can the voice, and I think not, but do we want to recognise Indigenous communities within the Constitution? I don't have a problem with that, but I don't think the concept of a voice, a unified voice, is a reality now.
Of course, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, I guess it's not going anywhere. And, of course, voice, treaty, truth-telling was a process that the voice was setting Australians on a path to. And, of course, there are a number of states that either have a treaty process or they're preparing for that treaty process. No doubt, whatever truth-telling means, that's already happening as well. The ball is rolling here. Do you think, Greg, that a national no in the referendum may actually be a cancelling of that process, or do you think that those other elements are likely to still continue to propagate around the nation, and that there is still value in, for the Aboriginal community, the thought of voice, treaty or truth-telling?
Yeah, good points there, Neil. Look, as I said, when I spoke to Indigenous community members that I know really well, there was disagreement, uncertainty. There was no clarity on what the voice wanted to achieve. Now, in my view, what's happening is that, you know, one of the things I was disappointed in, Neil, was that the church was very silent on this. By the church, I mean the various denominations. You know, there was some virtue signalling. Yes, we accept the Uluru Statement from the heart, but there was no real leadership, in my view, on what should be a Christian perspective to the voice. Now, as I said to you again, Galatians 3:28, neither Jew nor Greek, we are all one under the Australian flag. And I think that should have been the approach. But the issue we've got here is that we've got to be very careful that what the outcome as a result of the vote on Saturday, will mean for the Indigenous community, because I think they do need recognition, they do need some support, but there are already some 30-odd organisations that are trying to cater for them, and they can't agree amongst themselves either now.
Hey, just taking you in to the deep end here for a moment, Greg, because as you know, and you're with the Anglican Church, it's your background, when we start talking about issues and they become politicised, it's almost a way of cancelling the church's comments into that field, because you know as well as I know that the church leaders are reluctant to speak out when there is something that is politicised, because they don't want to be partisan, because there are people on both sides of the fence in their congregations, in their churches, in their denominations. So the thought that everything somehow is political, something has to happen here, that church leadership at the denominational level has to be able to speak even though things get politicised. I'm taking you in the deep end here, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Neil, my thoughts are very clear. I believe church and state is a reality. The church has to speak out on issues. The church must be involved, because whatever we do on a daily level, the church will be involved. Now, I think what needs to happen is for church leaders, whether it's Baptist, Presbyterian, Anglican, I don't care, uniting, they need to come out as on the issues. Now, everything is political, Neil. Unfortunately, I did not see any leadership from any of the churches, that I can recall. And I think one of the things that we need to happen here is that, we've got to get the media on side, Neil. We've got to get governments on side. But more importantly, I think we as Christians need to understand the fact that, the church and in particular the issue of the voice, we need to support it in the sense that we need to make sure that there is a voice for the Indigenous community, but not through the voice that was proposed by Prime Minister Albanese. That just wasn't going to work.
Okay, there's lots to talk about, and we could talk about that for a long, long time. I think listeners would like to even have their say, but we can't make that happen today. Let's talk Israel, the Hamas-Israel war. And things seem to be in a holding pattern now. Israel is preparing to move in and try and, in some sense, take down Hamas. What are your reflections on what's been happening so far as this dreadful circumstance in Israel?
Look, Neil, I'm absolutely, I am still in a state of shock, because you and I both know, and the world knows, Hamas is nothing more than a terrorist organisation funded by Iran. The issue that we've got here is, Neil, that Jews and Christians, Neil, have been persecuted for centuries. Now, there is nothing in the Bible, Neil, absolutely nothing, that says that the persecution of Jews needs to continue. One of the things we've got to understand is, and I look at I was just looking at Psalm 122:6, Neil, which really says that we need to pray for peace for Jerusalem. And I think that's so critical, Neil, that we do that. If you want to talk of conflict, Neil, go back to Ezekiel chapter 38 and you'll talk about. See, one of the things we've got here is that this could be Israel's 9/11, Neil. And that's a real issue, because if it is the 9/11, then we all need to worry, because if, let's say, Russia gets involved or whatever, then we need to make sure that we are praying for Israel. We're praying for the innocent Palestinians, of course, that are being killed. But, Neil, the left-wing media, the left-wing politicians are not letting this go, and unfortunately they're putting the blame on Israel when it should be the other way around.
And certainly, I know your perspective is this. There is no moral equivalence in what we're talking about here insofar as goodies versus goodies. There are actually goodies versus baddies here. And you've got good, as in Israel, and you've got bad, as in Hamas. There are some people who are trying to somehow or other produce some level of moral equivalence, but you've got to be able to recognise good and evil here, haven't you?
Absolutely. I mean, Israel has to defend itself. It had Hamas took the initiative. It took the initiative to attack Israel. Israel is now responding, and from a biblical perspective, I think there is room here for a retaliation from Israel. See, one of the things I can't come to grips with, for example, the USA is supposed to be supporting Israel. But guess what, Neil? Biden gave Iran $6 billion worth of funding. Now, why would you fund a country that is promoting terrorism? So there are real issues here, Neil, and I think we need to be aware that it's not just simple. But, the last time this sort of war occurred was back in 1973 with the Yom Kippur War, as you'd be aware of, some 50 years ago. Neil, we've got to make sure that our prayers are strong and prayers for Israel for peace because, I think, Psalm 122:6 says it. Let's pray for Jerusalem.
And with all sorts of predictions that this may well grow into, someone said a mini world war because there are proxies, those Israel and Hamas, but the backers of those extend to nations around the world. So that's something to pray for, the peace of Jerusalem. Hey, and I know that you've got something special coming up on Thursday night. You've got Dr. David Adler, the president of the AJA, the Australian Jewish Association. He's going to be your guest with a podcast, a live stream called Israel Under Attack. Just a quick word about that, because I do want to quickly touch on Notre Dame. That's coming up on Thursday.
Yeah. Neil, very quickly, yes, I have got Dr. David Adler, who's become a good friend, and I've spoken to him about what's the implications for Christians as a result of these attacks by Hamas. So it'll be an engaging interview. It's on our website if people want to register, but it will be a really good insight into what's happening in Israel from somebody that knows firsthand, Neil.
Okay, you were in France, you visited Notre Dame Cathedral. So many of us will remember the huge fire that's destroyed part of such an historic building. What's happening there? You were there and you saw what had happened, you saw the restoration. What's happening with Notre Dame Cathedral?
Well, Neil, I was there because the first disaster was Australia couldn't make the rugby union final. I mean, I gave up on them, so I said, I've got to look at something else. And I went to Notre Dame, and Neil, I have to tell you very quickly, it was so encouraging to have thousands and thousands of people visit Notre Dame. And I think, that something like the restoration of the Notre Dame may well be a reversal of people coming to recognise the importance of the church from a historical perspective. So I was so encouraged, Neil. It's looking great, but wow, what a piece of architecture, Neil. And I felt a real spiritual connectedness with the church there. So, it was a great experience, Neil. I'll send you some photos.
Hey, and you know what? The historic church and architecture, now that's probably a bigger conversation for another day too, but when we appreciate that cathedrals like that take 100 or 200 years to build, compare that with what it takes these days to build modern infrastructure and architecture. But what we're seeing is the works of art that have been shaped by believers through the centuries.
Yep. Amen. And it's a real encouragement. I went back and had a look at some of the historical aspects of Notre Dame. I spoke to some people, and I tell you what, Neil, it is spiritually uplifting. And I'm blessed to be able to have seen the church again.
Well, Greg Bondar is National Director of Christian Voice Australia. It is a national think tank and advocacy group for families, liberty and faith. You might want to register for that webinar coming up on Thursday night with David Adler. But ChristianVoiceAustralia.blog, ChristianVoiceAustralia.blog to connect with Greg Bondar. Perhaps become a prayer partner. There might be some ways you can contribute. You might be able to subscribe to some mailings and keep up to date with the issues. So ChristianVoiceAustralia.blog. Greg, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
God bless you, Neil, and for the work that you do.